Once I had a good amount of wool on my spindle, I'd have to take it off so that I could keep spinning. And I wouldn't want it to get knotted, that would be a nightmare. So I have this, which is called a weasel. And I would wrap the wool around the weasel to keep it from getting knotted. This would also count the number of yards. And there's an old song. All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought was all in fun. Pop goes the weasel. Because most weasels had a counter on them. And you would set it for a certain number of yards. And when you had wrapped that number of yards onto your weasel, the weasel would pop. And it would go, pop goes the weasel. And this is how I would keep my yarn from getting tangled. By counting the number of yards, I would know how much I had for weaving or knitting. Why do we say that? Or why do we call somebody that in this case? In colonial America, every woman was married. She was a widow, she would probably remarry quickly because nobody could do it all themselves. And if there was a woman who never got married, who never left her father's home, and later would probably live with a brother or a sister, she would be given the job of spinning wool and linen for that family. Because somebody always needed to be spinning in order for there to be enough fiber for clothing and sheets and diapers and towels. And so she would be called a spinster. And until recently, unmarried older women were still called spinsters, and that's why. I'd like to thank Whitney from Henny Penny Farm for donating all the beautiful fleece I've been using for this demonstration. I really appreciate it. So every girl, by the time she was 6 years old in colonial America, was expected to be able to knit socks for her brother. And they would have knitting bees where the little girls in the village would get together and have a race to see who could make a pair of socks first. So knitting was used to make clothing such as hats, scarves, socks, mittens, and shawls. Sweaters were not yet in vogue, and so very rarely would you see a knitted sweater. But here is some knitting on wooden knitting needles, no different done now than it was done then. And here is a little hat I made for a child for colonial times out of the yarn that you've seen me spinning and cleaning and carding and all of that. This is the finished product. This would be a nice warm woolen hat for the winter. Now, sometimes there were other colors because sheep come in different colors, and also wool could be dyed, but that was a whole nother process. And the fact that you had dyed wool was kind of showing off a little bit because it meant that you had extra time to spend on that or that you had extra help. Some wool was also used for weaving, but most people did not have a loom. There were traveling itinerant workers who would go from farm to farm every spring. They would set up their loom in your barn, and they would weave for you for a few days until they had used up all the yarn that you had spun all winter. So all winter, while the garden was quiet and the snow was falling, the family would be processing the wool. Come spring, they would have some amount of yarn, and it would then be woven by these mostly men weavers. Some people would have a loom, but not everybody. Everybody would have a small loom to make things like shoelaces and belts and straps and tapes for holding their clothes on, but to have a big loom to make a full piece of fabric, usually was done by a passing worker.